We're doing right now is we're in that's where I was last night, up there looking out onto all of New York, and it was freaking incredible. And this is the exit of the World Trade Center Memorial, which takes you down to the train station there, which one of them takes me, for me in my case, up to Newark. But on September the 11th 2001, two aircrafts allegedly flew into the World Trade Center. And I use the word allegedly not because I'm trying to insinuate anything other than that's what happened, but we have issues because the post 9/11 investigation, there were no witnesses that could be subpoenaed, no witnesses could be put on sworn under oath. There were entire chunks of the World Trade Center, like the actual forensics, was dug up, put on a barge to China before any examination of it was actually done. World Trade Center 7, which collapsed at the same time, isn't even mentioned in the 1,000-page report, which is, I had a chance to have Glenn Kyle on my show, who was a former member of the Central Intelligence Agency and the author of a book called The Interrogator. And I said to him, look, before, I'm not going to go too deep on this, but I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then we'll back up and we'll talk about your book. He was cool about that. And then we came up, and I said, well, do you think that a proper investigation was done? And he went, of course, yeah, well, yes, of course it was. And he'd just been telling me about his book, and The Interrogator was basically how a group of the members of the intelligence community and politicians were running their own foreign policy, and they were doing things without the approval of Congress, very much like Iran-Contra. And yet he struggled in his thinking to equate the fact that, well, maybe actually something similar could have been behind 9/11. Now, where we are 23 years later after the event, after September 11th, is that from time to time different governments come up and they talk about reopening the file on Saudi Arabia. So what you can extrapolate from that without going into the realm of conspiracy is that even the authorities recognise that the official explanation is inadequately, it doesn't really answer anything, and that there is a much bigger, broader picture. I think my feeling when I've looked at the situation, and I'll put this in context, when I looked at it, I come from a position where in October I co-authored an article with Ian Wishart, who's admittedly, some people find him a bit on the far right and conservative, which I accept. I don't actually work a lot with Ian anymore, but at that time, he just published my book, and he ran this magazine, Investigate, which I wrote a few articles for, and one of them was the Pacific Jihad. And in that article, the third paragraph down of Pacific Jihad, what we cover is basically the knowledge that back then the US intelligence been fully aware that basically Osama bin Laden and his cohorts were planning to attack a target in the United States of America, and that their target was going to be, well, their weapon of choice was going to be civilian aircraft. So I've got that on record. That's you can't take that away from me. That's my first-hand experience. And so when we turn around, we talk about the authorities saying, well, they had no idea this was going to take place. I say, from what I wrote prior to 9/11, that's bullshit. And furthermore, I was one of about 600 journalists who wrote about that case, and it was actually the case we were writing about was called Operation Bojinko. Now, Operation Bojinko is, look it up, and you'll find that one of the masterminds was indeed linked to the 9/11 Khalif Mohammed, who was in the US and managed to get away from being basically arrested by authorities, supposedly because they didn't have the right spelling, even though his address was care of the Bin Laden Construction Company. It beggars belief. But Operation Bojinko was actually much more detailed than what we wrote in Pacific Jihad, where it's actually basically named, basically targets will include, hey, in squirrels we trust, the rest we bust. And I always love my squirrels. These guys are such show-offs. You feel like they're agents for Vogue. Anyway, so back to the thing. So in Operation Bojinko, they named the World Trade Center, they named the Pentagon, they named the White House, and I believe the Senate. And so they were very deep. They had very detailed intelligence. And again, John O'Neill, who last night I went out and had tried a few ones over and missed O'Neill's name, who basically was working to work for the head of the head of security for the World Trade Center on September the 11th, employed by a group called Connick and Associates, who also were very significant in relation to shutting down an investigation into hundreds of millions of dollars that were washed through US through the World Trade Centers in the hours before the attack. Now, the article, go look for Conva, and I had to dig up the hard copy, pop copy of that paper because that story got buried real quick. And a year later came through, and the engineer turned around and said, "Look, I can't say anything now because we're owned by a different company, which is Conan Associates." And all I can say is go back to what I said back then. But the point is, John O'Neill knew this was about to happen. He wasn't the only one. He worked for the FBI and their anti-terrorism organisation. And he was one of about 15 agents in the FBI who, throughout different parts of the United States, had found significant signs of a clear and present attack basically about to take place. All of these ended up in one office, the FBI office, which at that time was run by Robert Mueller, of the who's very famed for his mishandling of the BCCI investigation, which was the bank that handled a lot of the Iran-Contra deals, which was matched dollar for dollar by the Saudi Arabians. So it puts American intelligence in a very tricky position, because if they do point the finger at Saudi Arabia's got about 20 years of knowing where they'll bury the bodies, and can basically put them in the shit as well. So it's if in terms of how they can get away, well, that one is when you blackmail the guys that are going to investigate it. That's a pretty good way to go about it. That's of course speculation, because that's yet to come out. But as I said, we have seen presidents talking about the Saudi Arabian file. 15 agents basically went to Mueller's desk, all got stopped. We had a military intelligence investigation. Able Danger Gain had the cell that Muhammad Ahmad was involved in, the Berlin cell. And that cell, just to clarify this again, is in terms of the smoking gun. Jane's intelligence points out that in the days after 9/11, that the Muhammad Ahmad was seen basically meeting an Iraqi colonel in Czechoslovakia, and that the colonel handed him anthrax. And then that story disappears when it turns out the anthrax is actually traced back to Fort Detrick's. Now, the significance of it was that what we can show from that particular case was that A, there was an Israeli operation involved, that B, they were having Muhammad Atta under surveillance, or more significantly, what was actually happening was the Czechoslovakian police were pointed out, the Israelis pointed out, said, "See that guy, he's Muhammad Atta, and that's an Iraqi guy." So what we have is basically a case of Israeli intelligence actually being caught, actually organising their guy before the event, and that's a very significant point. But anyway, we could go on and on and on and on. Sufficient to say that when it happened, you have things like the Project for New American Century, which basically allowed the rearming of America and remilitarization and the increasing the power of the military-industrial complex exponentially, and it's given them powers which the civil liberties have never been returned since it's been taken over. That set in, wars like that, set in motion things like the events that happened in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Russia, and here we are. And then we of course had COVID, and all these things have come out again out of this Project for the New American Century, which most of the people who claim to be left wing don't bother to actually go and actually read, and then they have an opinion, and it really bugs me about that, because it's like, and these are 3,500 people. And, for all the ones that says, oh, well, fake actors and stuff like bullshit, there's their names. They have places, they have addresses. And it's quite remarkable when you go there, nobody is talking. Everyone's just silent and being respectful. Some things, to see it is incredible. It's All right, guys, I think we'll call call it a day there.